Hello, greetings and salutations. My name is Ivan Francis Wilbanks, and I'm your host for another episode of Cutting the Strings, a podcast where we talk about life, philosophy, and sometimes cultural points that are of interest. And so today we're going to talk about something that I've seen talked about on several other channels on YouTube. And this has been a discussion for a lot of older gay men, or I would say aging millennial gay men, who have really existed in this society where the world seems to be going upside down. A lot of things seem to be happening, but we're still trying to live our best lives. And so, in light of that, today we're going to talk about why gay men still struggle to date and talk with other gay men and trying to either date them, socialize with them, even if we're trying to link up just for a casual time. We're going to get into why so many gay men have trouble. And this is not just going to be me just doing a scientific analysis of it. I'm not going to do that. But I think it's important to use anecdotes to really talk about this and hone this problem home because I have experienced this as well. And I'm not afraid to be vulnerable to share my experiences for several different reasons as to why I've experienced difficulty or why I've seen others experience difficulty. And so, without further ado, let's get into it. So the question is, why do some gay men have trouble, or a lot of gay men have trouble navigating a lot of spaces, whether they be, as innocent as a bar or meeting someone at a restaurant or meeting someone at a grocery store, all the way up to, dalliance functions or dark rooms, right? I guess the reality of it is a lot of this comes down to three core reasons that a lot of gay men struggle. And the three core reasons that I've identified are number one, there are community expectations about how a person can show up. And those community expectations can have a tendency to be unrealistic. The second reason that I've identified is that many gay men have adverse experiences and it ruins their confidence and it ruins their concept of worthiness. And the third one is that it sometimes feels as though when you're dating or you're trying to interact, that you need to learn a different language, a non-spoken, non-verbal language that is sometimes not intuitively picked up. Unless someone tells you, you really just don't know, or unless you've experienced it enough through repetition and you've been in those spaces, you really wouldn't know. And so those are really the three things that I've seen through my own experiences and just kind of talking with a lot of my other colleagues and friends out here in Atlanta. And quite frankly, it's interesting because we often don't talk about it in the realm of people having difficulty dating or difficulty talking with. I do find it interesting because we make it seem like it's just go out there and just do it. And going out there and just doing it is the way to do it. I will say that something I've been advised and something I was told to do. And a lot of my friends and counterparts have been told to do essentially the same thing. Just throw yourself to the wall and see if you stick. And I think, quite frankly, it's a good way to go about it. But when you go about it without understanding the why, it can create a myriad of other issues and also make for experiences that you may not want. So, getting into the first section where we're talking about how community expectations can show up and really alter that experience and really make things feel tight for a lot of people is that there are community expectations on how someone is supposed to show up, right? So, like, case in point, I love my nails. I love my nails. My nails are going to be done. And the reality of it is that there are a lot of gay men even gay men who are more feminine presenting that don't particularly care for that. Now, it's a preference, right? And I can't fault people for their preference. But the one thing that I've realized is that there's one thing to have a preference and to be respectful with your preference, and it's another to be an asshole and you use your preference as a way to quantify doing it or being that way. And I think that people sometimes don't think about it. They don't really, capture that mindset of, yeah, there's a way for you to pursue your preference, but also not just diminish someone else's dignity in the process. And I think some people don't acknowledge that that is a thing. The other thing too is that when you're walking in a community where there are unrealistic expectations of how you're supposed to sound or what your body's supposed to look like, it really can give you a very strong sense of of just a really skewed sense of how you view yourself. Case in point, when I started, being out in the gay community, I was 18 and this was back in 2011. Oh, so long ago. And I'm gonna be honest with you, when I first came out and started trying to date and trying to interact and trying to be out in the community. In 2011, I was living in DC. DC was very similar to a lot of other cities at the time. The gay culture at the time was a hell of a lot less accepting of bigger bodies, a lot less accepting of men that didn't sound as masculine. They definitely didn't talk about nails, and they definitely didn't talk about wearing heels or wearing bags. That wasn't a thing back then. And the other part of it was there was the strong almost like shift beginning to happen towards the porn star aesthetic, where everybody was trying to look like an OnlyFans model. And it hadn't gotten to that point yet, but it was starting to slowly make its way because we had this rise of social media and the rise of Instagram at the same exact time. And so I remember being in DC trying to date, and I was catching hell at 18 years old because it was you don't sound the way you're supposed to. Your waist size isn't the right size. I remember trying to talk to guys in DC back in 2011, and they would basically ask really strange questions like, "What is my waist size?" And I'm like, "Why do I have to give you my waist size?" You know, and it would be, well, I'm not willing to date you if unless your waist size is a 34, 36, and smaller. And, again, I'm a thicker body. So, of course, I'm wearing size 36 and 38, and that's how it's been the majority of my adult life. Now, the reality of it, though, is that for a lot of gay men, it's an unrealistic expectation to expect every man on planet Earth that you are interested in to have a waist size below 36. Now, granted, that is to be said that you have a preference for a smaller frame, right? But at the same time, in having a preference, the one thing I did experience a lot of was reaching out and having to get asked this question of what my waist size was. And when I responded saying what my waist size actually was, it will be things like, and you think that you could talk with me? You think that you can date me with this waist size? Or, oh, come back in your size 36 or smaller. Stuff like that. And so when you deal with that, kind of sit back and think, huh, when am I ever going to be enough to function and work within this sort of system? And be honest with you, when you're a younger, impressionable gay person and you're living in that sort of environment, you're living in that sort of space, you're experiencing these sort of dialogues and conversations, it really does begin to impact your ideology of whether or not you're attractive. It begins to really wear on your self confidence. It begins to wear on a lot of different things because now all of a sudden you've entered a world in which there's unrealistic expectations about how you should look and how you should sound. There's unrealistic expectations about the size of someone's genitals, right? Some people will literally be size queens, not just about the front, but also about the back. And so at the end of the day, you're going to deal with people who are very, very, very unapologetic and very particular about what they want as far as what their partner's genitals should look like. Now, again, preference is preference. But at the same time, you can also still state your preference without trying to destroy someone's dignity and embarrass them in the process. So, I can definitely say that from experience. There have been times where I try to interact with people and we'll get in the room, everything seems fine. And then the next thing you know, they look down and they will look, cock their head to the side and say, "Yeah, I need to get dressed and leave." And the thing is, the reality of it is that that's embarrassing for anybody to have that happen. But the reality of it is that, again, let's think about this. For a lot of gay men are out here thinking that each person should be walking around with 8 inches, 9 inches, or better. And the reality of it is that not everybody is going to be equipped that way. As a matter of fact, if you go to the science says that the average male phallus is probably about 6.5 inches on average. And it varies from region to region, but generally, 6.5 seems to be the upper limit of what that average tends to be, right? So if you're walking around with 7, you're actually doing better than most people on average. If you're walking around with 8, well, you're golden. But the reality of it is that not everybody is going to be able to be walking around looking like a porn star without their clothes on. That's just not a possibility because that's not everybody's thing. Everybody's genetics aren't the same way. And so when you have that unrealistic expectation of having everyone have the same muscle bodies with huge genitals, it begins again to really warp your sense of, do I fit in this space? So the other thing that I want to talk about too is this unrealistic expectation of masculinity, right? I think that that was something that was a lot more prevalent back in 2011. prior to the 2020s. I mean, in the 2010s, it was a lot more prevalent in the early part of the 2010s for people to have this expectation of unquestioned masculinity. And if you weren't masculine, you were not seen as worthy to be dateable. That's what it felt like, or that's what it seemed like. And I'm glad that the signpost has kind of moved where now it's a little bit more, you can be a little bit more flexible in how you present. You can be a little bit more flexible in how you speak. You see a lot more of more masculine presenting people who are now walking around wearing, getting their nails done and doing things that are more expressive because because the reality of it is that you can't continue to live in an oppressive system and then gain happiness from it. And I think that's something that a lot of people, especially people who previously adhered to this concept of being strictly masculine, they begin to realize this is not it. Maybe I might want to do something different, and maybe the rules just don't quite make sense. And so that's essentially what happened. The signpost moved over time. But we still see that there is this internal pressure where people have to put up a front or put up a performance in order for them to be able to operate in systems and date and socialize. One thing I will say is, my tone of voice or my speaking voice is exactly this. I've always sounded like this. And for some people, they will mistake me as a woman often for this exact reason. And so I have had a lot of times where, again, we'll get on the phone and it's, hey, are you who you say you are? I thought you were a man, not a woman. And again, you get that sometimes, but it's the reality of you're dealing with not just necessarily a fact that you're dealing with someone's preference, but you're dealing with a preference that's wrapped up in a really strong misogynistic undertone that really undergirds and really undermines the ability for people to make connection. And I think that's really the unfortunate part about it because these unrealistic expectations really cut off the ability for people to make new friends and make connections with people who may be really cool people. Because again, there's this perception of worthiness that comes attached to it. And we're going to bring up this word worthiness again and again because I think this is something that prevents a lot of gay men from really jumping out there and talking to people, or really it prevents them from being able to feel comfortable. I know it did for me. And it's even something that I still face day to day, right? And going out there and trying to talk to people in Atlanta. But the one thing that I will say is that the concept of worthiness is something that is a falsehood in some respects because worthiness is not wholly based upon someone else's assessment of you. It's based on your own self assessment. But we'll get back to that in just a second. Now, the second reason that I will say that many gay men have trouble trying to date or trying to talk or trying to create connections with other people is, we have a lot of adverse experiences. I think that a lot of people don't understand that a lot of gay men who especially live in the United States, especially gay men of color who live in the United States, a lot of us have had adverse experiences that color and shape how we move about in the world, right? So, for instance, I'll speak for me. A lot of the experiences that I had very early in my formative years of trying to go out and date and trying to casually link up with people, and very late in my teens into my early 20s, I didn't have great experiences with that. And so as a result of me having those adverse experiences, it kind of colored a lot of what happened later on the same exact way. And I know that they say, "Oh, if you have trauma, go to a therapist and have them figure it out." Yes, that's what we should be doing. I know I do it. I go to a therapist often, and I've been going to see one for the last 5 years. But even with that being said, it still colors how we approach situations. Colors our abilities to take risks or our willingness to take risks. It colors our whether or not we have social anxiety or not. And as someone who experiences social anxiety, part of the reason why that has happened is because of the fact that those adverse experiences have really put me in a place of being wary of being around other people who potentially could do the same sort of emotional or psychological damage. And so, with that being said, when we talk about these adverse experiences do ruin gay men's confidence. When you are in a space, and I'm just using this as an anecdote, again, going back to what I mentioned earlier, even for a man who is not gay, right? Even a straight man would probably feel a way if they were anticipating having a casual encounter. They get in the room, they take off their clothes, and the person that they were got the hots for looks down, cocks their head to the side, and says, "Hey, I'm getting dressed and I'm out." Right? all in response to the size of someone's genitals, right? That would really leave someone feeling a certain sort of way, and it probably wouldn't leave you feeling confident or really, really good about yourself. And while some guys will say, "I'm just brush it off, it's fine. You got, millions of other options." The reality of it is that that experience can still have a rocking sense of exactly how you feel about yourself and how you feel about your body, right? Because even though you may not actively think about it, it's still something that plays in the subconscious of your mind over and over again. And if it's left unchecked, it can morph into a lot of bigger issues, such as, some sense of body dysmorphia or some sense of unworthiness because you feel as though other people are not going to take you seriously in the sexual role that you wish to engage in, right? Another example that I'll also use is tops versus bottoms and exactly who is a proper appropriate top and who is an appropriate bottom. And I say appropriate with quotation marks because it's silly to talk about who is appropriate as a top and who's appropriate as a bottom based on how they present. I think that that's absolutely ridiculous. And again, it's tied into heteronormative politics that a lot of gay men try to pander to, but really doesn't work very well for us because heteronormative values tend not to really work out very well in a homosexual sort of world. That's just how I look at it. Now, when you're really getting down to the nitty gritty of it, however, it is really important to realize that being in spaces where your confidence is being shot at and you feel as though you're under attack, it is imperative for you as a person who's going through that moment to try to leave the situation to spare yourself and your mental health. I'm not necessarily saying that you're not going to have a bad day or have a bad moment or you're not going to run into assholes. Because again, there's 8 billion people on planet Earth and you're bound to run into somebody who's going to act like they have no common sense or no semblance of truth about them. But at the end of the day, you still have to realize that it's imperative for you to spare yourself your dignity and your own mental health if people are trying to damage that and destroy it. And again, from my own vantage point and my own experience, when we are longing and seeking that person or longing and seeking a certain experience, sometimes we're willing to put up with more than what we should be putting up with. I know for me, in my own experiences, the biggest mistake that I made oftentimes is allowing people to make disrespectful comments about my body or my voice or how I show up, hoping and praying that if my lack of dissension will make me more attractive. And it doesn't. It actually makes you more of a pushover and less attractive in the eyes of a lot of people, right? That being said, don't violently react to people, don't throw hands, don't fight them. But it's important to also be very clear about your boundaries and demonstrate how much you love and respect yourself in the face of people that will try to play you like that. Don't get played by people and also be very, very clear about what you're expecting because, again, you are worthy and you are enough. Which brings me to my next statement, the concept of worthiness and being enough. A lot of times with a lot of gay men, particularly black gay men, we live in a world where we feel as though we have to keep doing and doing and doing and doing to gain a sense of worthiness. We have to out make money. We have to get out promoted. We have to do everything to outrank our counterparts in order for us to be seen as a viable option. And even amongst ourselves, we do the same exact thing, right? It is this concept of being worthy enough to date relies upon this concept of, oh, is my body looking a certain way? Do I sound a certain way? Do I have the right type of money and material possessions for people to really take notice of me? And it's a mistake that a lot of gay men make, especially when they're younger, because of the fact that we are wrapped up in this culture where we're trying to put on, we're trying to look the most attractive so that a appropriate suitor comes and sweeps us off our feet. And even if it's not permanently, at least we get our 30 minutes to an hour of fun, right? And that's a lot of what happens. We have a lot of that going on where you get lost in this maze of materialism and superficiality where you end up losing the plot and your idea of worthiness gets tied to things that are superficial. I know that for me, I ran into that problem when I was younger. And at 32, I'm still kind of digging myself out of that hole. I'm still thinking about those things and working my way out of it because your values will shift. What's important to you will shift, right? I always say that how you look at the world at 18 is not how you look at it at 25. How you look at it at 25 is not the same way how you look at it at 30. And how you look at it at 30 is not going to be the same as you look at it at 35. And the same is true with dating, and the same is true with even creating casual encounters or casual connections for friendship. Your basis of doing those things begins to shift because your priorities change. So for me, my priorities of having the nice body and the nice whip and all that other things, those things change. Right? Those things are no longer my priorities because at 32, my priorities are my career, having home ownership, building a retirement account, trying to travel the world and learn a different language. Those are now my things that are taking precedence sometimes over me wanting to go ahead and look cute and before somebody else. And I think that that is, again, a natural part of life. But the thing is that when you're dealing with the concept of worthiness, even as your priorities change, you need to check in with yourself. One of the biggest things that I learned in therapy is that the concept of worthiness should always be tied to your own signposts and your own goals, right? It should never be tied to someone else's. And again, when you're working in a system or trying to operate in a system where you have unrealistic body expectations, unrealistic presentation expectations of how you should show up in a space, unrealistic expectations of how your voice should sound or how you should dress, right? You begin to really struggle with finding that sense of worthiness in yourself because again they're tied to all these superficialities and rules that just sometimes don't quite make sense. And I think that that is really the crux of something that we really need to look at but also be mindful of as we move along in this journey. And I think that for me, it was really helpful when I got to a place of actually talking to someone and even talking with my friends about this because oftentimes us as gay men, we live in this notion that we live as islands unto ourselves and our issues are unique to ourselves and they're not. Some of the friends I thought they had the most utmost confidence in the world, they really didn't have the utmost confidence. Or, the friends that I had that were underneath someone every 5 minutes, the reality of it was they still felt lonely. Those are things that you only can really get when you start having real conversations with either people who are in your circle, who are mature enough to have those conversations, or talking to even your mental health professionals who are LGBTQ aligned or allies. And I think that that's something that, as you kind of work through that process of establishing your own worthiness or reestablishing your own worthiness, you're going to really engage with that quite a bit. So, moving to the third and final part of it, we're talking about how sometimes dating or seeking casual encounters requires knowing a different language. And it's a different language from the sense of gay men communicate differently than a lot of other people. Coming from someone who has a degree in communications and culture, I went to Howard and got a degree in communications and culture, and someone who's read studies about how homosexual men and women interact in comparison to their heterosexual counterparts. A lot of times what we fail to realize is that gay men operate in a subculture and that subculture has its own language. And with it having its own language, there is a form of verbal communication and lingo that we have. With that verbal communication also comes the nonverbals that go with it. I mentioned this before on this channel, but in communication, 70% of what we communicate is not spoken, right? So, how I'm communicating with you right now is nearly the 30% of what I'm really going to provide, right? Based off of what I'm telling you right now, the words that I'm providing is nearly 30% of what this communication entails. The other 70% could be implied by my hand motion, my facial expression, how I'm dressed, the lighting, the choice of decor, right? There are so many different things that can convey a message. And I think that oftentimes when you are in a gay community or you're in a community of gay men who have historically been persecuted, the idea of communication being direct is actually a little bit of a misnomer. Because think about it from historical context, especially in the United States, but also it's true in other parts of the world, even today, being gay, being homosexual was a crime at one point in the United States. And I'm gonna be quite honest with you. I mean, it's looking a little scary out there for us here in the States right now. But the reality of it is that with it being previously illegal, and also being something that was subject to institutionalization through mental health professionals. The reality of it was that a lot of gay men had to find ways of meaning and creating ways of communicating that were not as overt, not as, crazy, not as, something that people are going to catch on to very, very easily. So the unassuming person would not be able to know. Well, fast forward nearly 50 to 60 years later, and there's still this trend or there's still this notion of gay communication sometimes not being as direct and sometimes taking on more indirect forms. So the one version I learned recently, and again, this is something I really got caught up in because I was like, what is the idea of what we call the gay stare? So I learned just this year at 32 that if we're in a club or a setting and another gay man is looking at you in a predominantly gay space, them looking at you and having their eyes follow you and trace you is not necessarily a bad thing. Now, where I'm from Philly, and coming from Philly, we don't stare at people. That is just asking for trouble. And culturally, that is not something that we do, right? It's a cultural difference for people in Philly to do that. We don't do that because we are very big on, we gonna mind our own business. So when I came to a gay space for the first time, and had eyes following me without words, mind you. They would follow me around the club and look, and I would catch their glance. I did not know that that stare, the catching of a glance, was an invitation to approach the person, right? But to me, that's a cultural difference. And it took me from the time I was 19 when I first experienced this up to 32 to figure out what that was. Because again, from my own cultural vantage point, we don't stare at people. That's not something that that's not something that's normal for me. That wasn't something that I found as appropriate pursuit behavior because that wasn't something I was raised to do. And to me, I mean, I think that it looks a little obvious and I think it's rude. But that's again to me based on my own cultural vantage point. But it took me, again, 13 years to learn that, okay, if someone is looking at you in the club like that and they're looking intently at you, they're interested. Go up and talk to them. Didn't even know it, didn't even understand it. And there are a lot of nonverbal cues that are just like that. That if you don't know, or even if you're neurodivergent, right, you're not going to figure that out very easily, right? Unless someone tells you or you're socialized in that sort of system. A lot of times, I also will see that this difficulty in learning the language comes from your proximity to how desirable you are in the system. So most of my friends that are very adept at navigating through this system tend to actually be more on the ideal desirability part of the spectrum, right? Either they tend to be, they tend to be the people that people want to fawn over, or their genitals are huge, or whatever have you. You name it, whatever it is, right? Whatever makes them attractive in the standard mainstream gay community, they're able to have that level of social capital and access. So as a result, they can be in those systems. They can know the language and learn the language, verbal and nonverbal, very quickly because they're interacting with that group of people. And so for people who are on the outs, who may not have that level of attractiveness, may not have that level of social capital or access, our ability to learn that nonverbal and verbal language is going to be a little bit more stunted because we're not in those same spaces and in those same rooms where those things are happening. We're not in those places where those conversations are happening. So we really don't know, or really are going to be a little bit slow to the line of actually learning exactly how to communicate in the ways that would allow us to be more successful and more connected to that portion of the community. I used to think of it as a failing on my own part because I did not understand or learn it, right? What I've learned now, however, in again, older age, not ancient, I'm not old, but I say it in a more mature space, is that learning that language was something that really could have made a difference in my experience, but I acknowledge why I didn't learn that language in the way that it was expected because I wasn't in the middle of it. I wasn't necessarily in the place of being considered that ideal so that I could land myself in the middle of the room where the things happen. And I used to look at that as again, oh, this is a failing on my part. Maybe had I just, had a different body type or sounded different, I would have been able to pick up on these things. But again, I don't really think that that is really the accurate way to look at this anymore, right? Because for me, even though I wasn't in the rooms where those things were happening, I took time to dedicate to other things. So while I may not have been in the spaces and in the clubs and in the dalliance parties, the dark rooms, right? I was doing other things such as getting an education or trying to gain financial stability. and trying to become financially independent. So while my priorities were different, the language that I learned was not going to be that language, but a different language altogether on its own. And so do I look back at myself and I say, "Woe is me"? No, right? I look at it as my priorities were different and aligned with something completely different than what a lot of other people's were at the time when I was in my early 20s. So now at 32, I may not have the language of being able to navigate a dark room or navigate dating spaces as well as other people, but I do have a different language to be able to operate in mainstream society with a little bit more um, fluidity, so to speak. And so, again, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but more so when you are connected to certain social spaces, your ability to learn the language, verbal and nonverbal, becomes easier. And for certain people who were not in that in crowd earlier on, we didn't learn it. So we're now picking it up later on in life, which creates a little bit more difficulty because you're essentially picking up what you would have picked up at 18, 19, and 20 in your 30s. And you now have all of the baggage, all the experiences, all the intuition that you gained through your 20s to now inform that language also that you're gaining in the 30s. It's interesting, but I will say from my own experience, it is definitely challenge because you're no longer as young as you were to pick up on it and take it and run with it. And your sense of responsibilities are changed, and your sensibilities are going to change a little bit too. But again, nothing wrong with that. Everything's fine with that because again, all of us have our own journeys. And so, with that being said, I now kind of just want to get to the meat and potatoes of some things that everyone should remember. In light of everything that I've just talked about, the first thing that I will say is to have grace on yourself. Human beings are complicated. How we communicate is complicated. The English language that I'm speaking to you in is complicated. I'm learning French. French can also be complicated. Humans are just complicated beings. And so, with that being said, you got to have a little bit of grace on yourself because sometimes it just won't always make sense. People are going to be people. People are going to be weird and have their own quirks. And because you're probably a person listening to this video, you're going to have your own quirks and oddities too. But don't worry, it's fine. Number two is that you are worthy. You are worthy, period. And I had to really, really drill down on this. And I'm still drilling down on it because it's a day by day thing. A lot of times, again, when you are working against the narrative that because of X reason you're not worthy, you have to really push yourself to feel as though you are worthy and make a definitive, declarative statement every single day that you are worthy enough to be in the space, to talk to this man or this woman, to talk to whomever, right? And be present. Because oftentimes, what happens is that when we begin to believe that we're not worthy enough, it begins to impact a lot of our abilities to do a lot of other things. It creates imposter syndrome. It creates the social anxieties, right? Or contributes to those social anxieties. And it leaves you feeling like you're never enough. And when you walk around the world with a sense of you're never enough, there's an exhaustion that overwhelms you. Where every time you walk out the house, you're like, I don't even want to be in front of people because I don't even think they're going to take me seriously. The reality of it is that as you work through those feelings, right, you have to remember that you are worthy enough because if you weren't worthy enough, you would not exist on earth. And the fact that you exist means that you are worthy enough in and of itself. Don't assign your worthiness or your value to the clothing that you're wearing because they too can depreciate in value unless you're wearing something that's absolutely gorgeous or it's a Birkin. Or, don't tie your worthiness and value to your looks because, as they say, beauty can fade. Beauty can be taken from you abruptly. That's just the world that we live in. So your worthiness and your value has to come from something that is not materialistic or something that is based on something that's physical. It has to come from something else. And sometimes that inherent value and that worth comes from merely just being in the space and being declarative. And you say, I belong here and that I should be here and that I will remain here if I choose to do so. So that is something that I try to do every single day, and I've really been doing recently in light of some changes in my life. And I really implore everybody else to do the same thing, especially for gay men and especially black gay men who have often been told in their lives that they're not enough and they need to prove themselves up to be a man or to be a productive member of society. So just keep that in mind. And the last thing I want to also say, and this is something I had to learn recently and really push on, is not every person is bad, right? Oftentimes, when we are in these systems where people are really nasty to us and really rude to us, we get this belief that, oh my God, I just want to divest of the gay community because all these gays are evil and terrible people and they're all messy. A lot of gay men fall into this contrarian, bitter mindset that almost is just as bad as being insufferable and being an asshole to other people. And the reality of it is that neither extreme is good. So, with that being said, I had to really have to come to Jesus and say, you know what? Not every other gay man that I run into is bad or they're evil or they have ulterior motives. Now, granted, it doesn't mean not be mindful of what's going on, but it means that two things can exist at the same time. It can be possible for the system to be bad, but good people to exist in it. And I think that as I've begun to learn that, I'm like, okay, I don't need to always be as anxious as I am with people. I don't always need to give people the side eye, even if they've done nothing wrong, right? Because it breeds this sense of bitterness and it breeds this sense of fire resentment towards people. And I don't think that that's something that we need to be operating on because there's already enough resentment and craziness happening in the world today. So, with that being said, you got to just really be mindful that one bad apple should not score the bunch. But if there is a bad apple, isolate it from everybody else and move accordingly. I've learned that time and time again, as the old saying goes, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so, with that being said, the same principle applies when you're talking about gay men who are existing in spaces who are merely products of an environment that really didn't give them a fair shot to begin with, unless they comply by very strict social rules. And so, hurt people are going to hurt people. And even hurt people who are hurting people don't really have much of a license to do so, right? It doesn't give them the excuse or the parents to do that. So, when you run into a bad apple, separate yourself. When you deal with someone who's insufferable and they don't seem to really want to try to be cool, distance yourself. At this stage in the game, especially as we're getting to the point where us millennials, especially us millennial gays, we're now getting to the point where we're reaching our 30s and our 40s, right? The oldest millennial that I run into who is a gay man is 49 years old at this point. Like millennials are no longer teenagers or little teeny boppers anymore. We're now officially working age adult. Some of us with mortgages, some of us with children, some of us some of us have even started to head towards early retirement. And so the grander scheme of it is that for those of us who are in this bubble now and are aging up in this bubble now, we don't have to be tied to the old things, right? And for the new people that are coming through, the new gays that are coming through beneath us, I think it's something to be mindful of that you cannot be beholden to these systems. Or if you're going to be beholden to the system, be aware of the system that you're working in. Because if you're not aware of the system that you're going to be working in, you're going to be a victim to it. And it's not good to be a victim to a system. It's better to sometimes be a matter of managing the system or navigating through the system as you need to so that you can exit the other side of it and escape. And the world is not what it used to be. And I had to acknowledge this even in my own therapeutic journey. The things that I dealt with in 2011 through 2018, I'll say, those are not going to be the same things that we're looking at in 2025, right? The world is different. Culture is different. The acceptance of gay people has shifted. And I'm not necessarily sure if in the current political environment that we'll say that it's more accepting or not, but we definitely can say that there's a lot more visibility and there's a lot more people who are a lot more on the left or the right about whether it's tolerated or it's not. But in navigating these systems, now I understand why so many gay men have issues dating, socializing, or even making the connection. And so, without further ado, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today, and I hope to catch you in the next one. If you like what you heard today, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you later on. So long.